The end of the 1960s was an era of extreme power and experimentation in the motorsport world. One such model was the 365 GTB4C, or the Comp Daytona. It was made to run in the most prestigious and challenging races, and is a Ferrari model that immediately got labeled as a leader. The Comp Daytona were a huge success in the GT category due to their incredible power along with their reliability in endurance races. In 1972, at the 24-hour of Le Mans, they won the top 5 positions in their class and repeated the win again in 73 and 74. However, the Comp Daytona continued its winning streak for years, coming in second overall in Daytona 24-hour as late as 1979. I love doing these videos and sharing with you a bit more about these cars that I'm so passionate about, but this car I'm extremely giddy to be able to film, because if you followed me for a while or follow my Instagram, you know that the Comp Daytona is one of, if not my all-time favorite car. My Instagram name is even Colleen 365 GTB4C, named after these cars. So I'm definitely gonna get into the details on these cars, the history, and just what makes them so amazing, but a little backstory as to why they're one of my favorite cars. So the very first Daytona Competizione Daytona was a prototype for Chinetti. And basically it was built by the factory for one of Chinetti's clients. So that was in 1969, and it was built for his client who wanted a race car. So Chinetti actually went to the factory and picked it up from the factory and drove the prototype Comp Daytona across the Alps to the racetrack. Now, there was a couple mechanical issues, so that car ended up not, DNFing and not running in that race, but it did race later on. And that was the very first Comp Daytona. It was all alloy. And my dad bought that car in 1972. It's serial number 12547. And he bought it in 1972 for $14,000. And then ended up selling it shortly later to buy his first building where he ran his restoration shop. And he sold it for $35,000 and realized he was a genius and he was in the Ferrari business forever. So that's kind of what kicked off his passion. And then I actually had a chance to go with him to the racetrack and ride passenger as a small kid in his Comp Daytona. He's had a few throughout the years. So that's what kicked off my passion for the Comp Daytona. There are a lot of visual differences. I mean, a Comp Daytona is pretty recognizable just from looking at it, but the reality is they're not drastically different from the street cars. Now, there's obviously some very significant differences, but the Daytona itself was such an amazing car that they didn't need to change a whole lot to make it a dominating race car. So when you look at it, obviously visually, there's a lot of aero and differences between the street and comp version. So when you look at the front, they all have these plexi nose, the plexi covered headlights. They have the fins and the side vents and wider or big wheel flares. But they also have the important parts for racing. So there's the wider tires, so more grip. There's a stiffer suspension, which is a lot better on the track, and cold air induction. So the top speed of this car is about 186 miles an hour. And that's not too far off from the street car, but a little bit extra is always great in racing. About 400, a little over about 402 horsepower. So it's just a freight train when you get it on the track. So this car is not one of the factory Comp Daytonas. It's a street car that was converted to comp specs, basically. And there have been quite a few conversions, but it's a little bit of the best of both worlds, where A real Comp Daytona, because they only made 16 factory cars and they were race-winning cars, they are many, many millions of dollars. So for a conversion, you still get all the power, performance of a Comp Daytona, but at a much more rational price. So for the actual Comp Daytonas, they made the first prototype in 1969, the one I spoke about earlier, that went to Chinetti. And then after that, in 71, 2, and 3, they made 5 per year. So the first 5 cars made were all alloy-bodied Comp Daytonas. And then the second set of 5 they made were steel-bodied, but they had the alloy hood and doors and trunk. And then the third series of 5, so the last 5 made, they had steel doors on them, but they still kept the alloy hood and trunk. So they changed a bit throughout the years. They're a little hard to differentiate just from sight, the difference between the 3 series, but there's slight differences. But for the most part, you're going to recognize a Comp Daytona when you see it, and seeing any of the 15 original or 16 original Comp Daytonas is an absolute treat. They did also make a few Comp Daytonas afterwards that were conversions in period. So another one of the Comp Daytonas my dad owned was one that was converted when it was new, so during the time they were still running, and that conversion actually ran at Le Mans in 1972. So it is definitely more valuable than a Comp Daytona that was converted, 10 years ago, but not quite as much that was, actually came from the factory. The Comp Daytonas were actually not ran by the Ferrari factory teams. They were given or sold to basically Ferrari's favorite privateer teams. So Chinetti with his North America Racing Team, or NART, or Francochamps. There's a couple different race teams that were allowed to have these cars. And if you think about it, there was the prototype, 15 built by the factory, and then 8 cars that were converted in period and raced in period. So they're extremely rare cars. I mean, really, they're even more rare than the infamous 250 GTO, although the GTO is a beast in its own, and it was even more dominant of a race car. So if you look at the Daytona lineup, there was a little over 1,000 Daytonas built, the normal street cars, all coupes, and then 122 Daytona Spyders built. And there was only the 16 original Comp Daytonas. So that is why they're partially why the rarity and then their amazing history in racing that makes them so valuable today. So this car was not called a Daytona originally. Ferrari called it the 365 GTB 4C, and it became universally known as the Daytona because of Ferrari's dominance at tracks at Daytona Raceway with the P4 and then with this car. So it just became dubbed the Daytona. And there's a lot of amazing things about this car as a race car. So the street version of the Daytona, some people don't like when they don't have power steering because it is a big, heavy front engine V12. So no power steering at low speeds is definitely a bit of an arm workout, but that's not what this was built for. The design didn't have parallel parking in mind. It was high-end, speeding down the track kind of performance. And when you are driving it to its potential and how it was built to be driven, that high speed, no power steering makes you feel very in tune with the car, very connected to it. So I've never been super opposed to no power steering in these cars because I don't mind the arm workout, and then at high speeds, it's a feeling you don't get with power steering. And then as far as race car goes, it's actually a really bulletproof car. So the engine is rock solid. I mean, for a race car, that's why they were so dominant at endurance racing. The biggest kind of issue people would have is with the transaxle. So basically, not a huge deal. You just have to shift under about 7,500 RPM, which is right below red line. And it's more kind of just babying the transaxle so it could last through those 8-hour or 24-hour races without blowing up. So as long as you're a bit more cognizant of the trans and making sure you don't let it rev too high, then these cars are really bulletproof. The interior of this car, so it is a conversion. There's some things that are still street Daytona kind of factory. So the AC system and the seats in this car are still stock from a street car. But if you look at the dash, you immediately see race car. It has on the passenger side the little stopwatches, and then under the AC controls right here, it has your main power switch, it has the fuel pump switches, and the key, when you turn it on, you don't crank the key, it has a start button too. So that's how Comp Daytonas work, but I love when you get a race car and it has all the switches. It's the inner child in me that just, especially the big red power switch, switching that on and hearing everything like turn on, and then switching on the fuel pumps, hearing the mechanical fuel pumps going behind you. It's just, it gets you kind of like excited to drive the car. And this car, because Comp Daytonas, they were built in a time when you could drive these on the street, drive it to the racetrack, race, and then drive home. So it's a car that is trackable and streetable. And basically, if you want this as a race car, great. Or if you want this just to take to Cars and Coffee and enjoy a really awesome looking car, you can do that too. I don't know how much your neighbors are going to appreciate you starting it at 6 in the morning to go to Cars and Coffee, but legally you are allowed to. So I have to mention the dry sump system in this car. And basically, to way oversimplify it, there's two kinds of systems. There's wet sump and dry sump. And a wet sump is the pan at the bottom that collects the oil, and basically when you're racing or driving really hard and you're taking corners, the oil will slosh around and sometimes not get picked up properly. So a dry sump system in a race car is really important because you're always getting the oil where it belongs. And another thing is it's a cylinder for a very specific reason. So basically the oil goes through here and creates a little, what's it called, cyclone kind of thing, and it pushes out any extra air. So you don't get air mixed in with the oil, so it stays the right kind of like viscosity. So it's a lot better for a race car for a lot of reasons. You're always gonna have, or you're supposedly always gonna have, unless something goes wrong, the right oil pressure.
2, 3, 4 or 5.
So 4 or 5 of the factory original
No, of the factory original cars. Well, I own the prototype, which I bought for $14,000, and it was my daily driver, 1972 to 1974.
Nice.
And then I sold it to buy my first building, but you know that.
Yeah.
I'd have to look in the database, but the prototype, then a privateer car that raced at Le Mans, and then
the silver one.
The silver one. I don't remember the serial number off the top of my head. And then at least 2 more. 12681, which I ran in the Ferrari Historic Challenge. And then another one that we rebuilt the motor and took it out to 5 liters.
Oh,
so
nice.
It was a monster. That car, I think, is in Switzerland today. So there's, what, 4 at least? But there may be more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what was your favorite part about racing them?
They're brutes. They really are a workout. Heavy steering, heavy brakes, acres of power.
Like a freight train.
Like a freight train. You know, when I get out of the Lamborghini GT3 car, after an hour of real racing, I feel fine. An hour in one of these things is a workout. You are beat to death.
But you still get out with a smile on your face.
Oh, yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah, no kidding.
It does all the right things. The problem is, like, for instance, when I was racing in the Historic Challenge, you know, I'd come around a corner and there'd be SWBs and I'd just go past them.
Yeah.
And then, even though, like the TDS were drum brake cars, they could outbrake me
Well, because they're lighter,
because they're lighter, and the SWBs had kind of sort of disc brakes.
kind of,
So,
sort of.
Yeah, but at a track, these were perfect at tracks like Le Mans and Daytona, where you have these long, forever straights. And they were very durable. If you kept it under the red line, they'd easily go 24 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful cars that look spectacular
Yeah, and sound amazing.
and sound amazing.
There are no lack of reasons to fall in love with the Comp Daytona. Its history, its dominance in racing, and I mean, you just look at it and it has that aggressive stance, it sounds amazing, and it's a car that you can track, you can drive on the street. It's an amazing car. I love it, obviously. It's one of my favorite cars. And I hope you guys have had a chance to learn a little something new about the Comp Daytona. If you like this video, learn something new, then please like and subscribe and stay tuned because we got a lot more coming very soon.